Thank you, and please also welcome Ajit Pai. It's first time in Hawaii, so that's especially exciting. And as most of you may know, Ajit, up until about a year ago, was the chairman of the FCC, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the regulator. And of course, before then, had been a commissioner, and lots of other public service. So he's done his time serving the U.S. telecom industry. But now he is a partner at Searchlight Capital, a global investment firm, and doing some other stuff. Let's just start off. What are you doing now, and how are you liking it?
Well, thanks, Patricia. It's just great to see you. Great to see anybody in person. This is one of the first conferences I've been to in quite a while. But no, as you mentioned, I'm one of the partners on the investment team at Searchlight Capital. We're about $10 billion assets under management. We've been around for a little over a decade, and we invest pretty heavily in all things TMT, satellites, cable, fiber, wireless, you name it. It's pretty much across the spectrum, pardon the pun, and just a great home for me. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, so keeping a toe in the policy waters, and otherwise it's been good. It's been a good time. Taking a step back from the FCC and being able to look at things from a different perspective.
Very good. And for our broader audience, the American Enterprise Institute is what we call a think tank in the United States, and
yes.
I guess they're market-oriented policies. And speaking about the market, what are you seeing from Searchlight? What new technologies are driving at least your team's investment decisions?
It's interesting. It's sort of a two-track approach that I've been working on over the last 9 months or so that I've been with the firm. One is, of course, on digital infrastructure, the hot topic, and especially in the United States, I think COVID has underscored the importance of digital connectivity in a way that pre-COVID I don't think had really grasped the national consciousness as much. So we're looking very heavily at residential fiber to the home companies or companies looking to build out fiber to the home. We announced recently a transaction with All Points Broadband, which is building a platform in Virginia. We've also got existing portfolio companies, Ziply Consolidated, which is a carve-out of Frontier Properties in the Pacific Northwest, where we're upgrading TDM infrastructure and building fiber, as well as Consolidated, which is across the country, but primarily in the Northeast, and looking to do much more of that. So that's sort of on the more traditional, I guess you might say, side. We're also looking at some emerging technologies, semiconductor, open radio access networks, companies like that might be more early stage for traditional private equity, but nonetheless have an interesting profile in the space, and we think might have some legs to go up going forward. So I feel like as I mentioned backstage, I feel like a student again, just constantly learning bombarded with information, including from some of the smart speakers we've heard already here. It's a great position, and I feel very fortunate to be in it.
That's great. And of course, you got the discussion going on Open RAN at the FCC during your time. Are you seeing interest in that globally, or is it largely in the US and, of course, a little bit of Europe? But what are you seeing, again, on Open RAN?
Definitely. I think there's a huge amount of conversation now that is materialized in a way that was somewhat abstract when we held the Open Radio Access Network Forum at the FCC a couple of years ago. Then we were bringing all of these companies across the United States and around the world, Rakuten, Altiostar, Mavenir, to talk about a concept that at the time seemed more abstract, but now you're actually seeing companies sign deals with some of these Open RAN vendors and think about reconfiguring or configuring, in the case of a standalone network, some of the networks they've got using Open RAN technologies. So it's really exciting, and I think across the United States government, one of the things I've been pleased to see is that the focus on creating a more secure, cost-effective wireless infrastructure network has continued across administrations. And so here, I think, from a political perspective at least, Washington seems to be relatively united. We want to innovate, and we also want security, and you can have both in the case of Open RAN, in the view of many.
Right. Now, with Open RAN, are you seeing it being targeted to a particular band of spectrum? Are folks looking at the mid-band to deploy Open RAN, or is it spectrum agnostic?
It's pretty spectrum agnostic, primarily mid-band. Somewhat lower band, I think, is where people have been focusing, but there's no reason in theory, at least, that it couldn't be somewhat spectrum agnostic. So we'll see how things develop. But certainly, I think C-band, 3.4, some of these other mid-bands, that's going to be the sweet spot, assuming there can be deployment.
Yeah, and we'll drill down into C-band in a moment.
Sure.
During your time at the FCC, you've got a lot of spectrum to market, starting with the millimeter wave bands, which are being deployed now, and we can talk about if you're seeing any of that in Europe and elsewhere in the higher spectrum. Of course, C-band, you got the discussion going, teed up the auction and the rules with CBRS. of course, that discussion started under your time, and then when you were chair, you revised the rules to make it perhaps more attractive to the bigger operators and with longer license terms, and although still retaining some of the attraction for smaller enterprise. And of course, the auction was pretty successful in terms of the diversity, right? We had, folks like John Deere, bidding a lot of spectrum for precision agriculture, and research institutions, a very broad swath of people. Is CBRS panning out as you expected it to?
I think so, and I think that, to me at least, one of the great markers, other than the conversations I've had with both carriers and vendors over the last year, has been a visit I've done recently. I was out in the Chicago area and visited Cambium, and got to visit with the engineering team that's creating some of these radios to leverage CBRS, and it was just incredible when they were talking about the functionality that literally would not have existed had we not pursued the CBRS rules and auction as we did. I mean, it's kind of heartening to know that people are innovating around the framework that we put in place, and so it's just great to see, and I hope that something that going forward will be much more the norm than the exception. And additionally, we've talked to some of the companies that are interested in creating the ability for companies to set up private LTE networks and leveraging either CBRS or unlicensed in the 6 gigahertz band, you name it. So there's a much greater range of flexibility for people to think about wireless now than there was in 2017. And I'd like to thank, obviously, the FCC staff, in particular the engineers and technologists who enabled us to figure out a way to thread that needle.
Yeah. And I'm a spectrum geek, so it bothers me when people throw out alphabetic, labels for bands. I started it. So the CBRS is 3550 megahertz to 3700 megahertz, although the FCC did retain that upper 50 for unlicensed or generally applicable, very license light. But next to that is the C-band, and of course you did get the auction revved up for that, and it was historic proceeds, I think, globally, right? At 81 billion plus another billion to clear it. But we hit some snags, so you want to talk a little bit about what your perception is on the safety of that? When are we going to clear that muddle between FAA and the operators?
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, we started this conversation in July of 2018, and at the time, we, the FCC, asked everybody, including the aviation industry, Department of Transportation, FAA, anybody else, we are proposing to auction off the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band. There will still be a 220 megahertz separation from the altimeters that are, start from 4.2 to 4.4. If anyone has any thoughts on potential interference, let us know. And so we got a whole bunch of technical analysis from many different quarters, including one study from the aviation industry, and we took a look at it, and the study was pretty easily debunked. So we went forward in March of 2020 and issued an order saying, we're going to dismiss these concerns because we don't see a sound technical foundation for these objections from the altimeter groups. But that said, keep in mind, we are moving forward with the C-band auction, and so we encourage the aviation industry and others who have a stake in that to think about upgrading altimeters in recognition of the fact that we're going to have 5G wireless from 3.7 to 3.98. Hold the auction, as you pointed out, the largest spectrum auction in terms of proceeds in world history. It's incredible when you think about it, starting from scratch, essentially, and creating this auction. Lo and behold, the last couple of months, all of a sudden, the DOT, the FAA, and aviation folks have figured out, oh, wow, we must have missed the boat somehow, so let's try to relitigate this issue. And to me, at least, I think the FCC got it right in March of 2020. There's been no, in my view at least, there's been no demonstration that there is a possibility of harmful interference. I mean, 220 megahertz separation is more than 2x the buffer that even Boeing had asked for back in 2019, 2020. So there's no possibility of interference here. And yeah, obviously the companies that won spectrum at that auction are now frustrated. Just this morning I saw that they've had to delay the introduction of 5G services again. And so we'll see where it turns up. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's up to the new FCC to to stand tall and decide on the basis of engineering rather than politics. And that's just, that's not the way to do things for American consumers, and we'll see where things go.
Well, and I noticed you and a number of your fellow former chairs wrote a letter to, I guess it was to Secretary Buttigieg on that, or maybe it was to Administrator Dixon, but, explaining that, what had happened and
yeah, and to get this group of six in particular on the same page on anything, it takes a lot. So when you look at that letter, I'd encourage folks, you can find it on the internet, which of course still works, and you'll see that, all of us stand on the basis of making decisions based on the facts. And, I think that's exactly what the FCC did. And I want to give credit to my 5 predecessors, Democrats and Republicans, who, again, agreed with that decision and urged our friends throughout the government to respect it.
And in your current role, you obviously have a global perspective at Searchlight Capital, and 39 other countries have deployed 5G or 4G in that same swath of spectrum, or broadly speaking, 3.4, perhaps to 3.8. Although some countries have gone up higher. I know that in the UK there's some private networks all the way up to 4.2. Now they're localized and they need licenses, and there's a buffer zone between their operations and any nearby airport. But so are you seeing any glimmer of concern or hearing anything that 39 countries are doing it, so are you hearing anything from your global peers out there?
No, not at all. I mean, you don't see planes falling out of the sky there. You don't see altimeters being affected. And to me, it's obviously the issue in itself doesn't have a foundation, but it kind of is resonant to me because a lot of the spectrum work we did successfully over the last 4 years engendered some type of opposition like this. The 24 gigahertz band. Oh, it's going to end weather forecasting. The L band. GPS is going to be destroyed. The 5.9 band. Automotive safety is going to be compromised, and thousands of people are going to die on the roads. Here, too, altimeters are going to fail and people are going to fall. I mean, every single decision you make, even though it's on the basis of sound engineering, it's very easy for the other side to go to the press saying, the sky is going to fall if I don't get my way. And one of the funniest things to me, and I testified about this the last hearing I had before the Senate Commerce Committee, it's very easy for people to say, I'm all in favor of 5G, just not in this band. Because then, of course, they want to essentially preserve the fiefdom that they've got. But that's not the way America is going to lead the world in 5G, and that's not the way that companies can innovate. I mean, you need those airwaves in order to create a business plan to deliver services to consumers. And so I'm really proud of the work we did on a bipartisan basis, I would add, over the last 4 years. And again, it's up to the new administration to decide how it wants to carry that torch forward, if it does.
Now, the cynics would say that the aviation industry just saw the proceeds of that historically, very high auction and thought, well, maybe I can get a little money of that from the Treasury to update my altimeters. There's some discussion that they're not really using the best altimeters that manufacturers can make today. And I am saying, you can comment on that in a moment, but to your point about relitigating and holding hostage some of the FCC decisions, I've seen that in the Wi-Fi 6 space, where under Ajit's leadership, the full 6 gigahertz band, 1,200 megahertz of spectrum. That's right. From, again, I'm a geek, 5.9 up to 7.1 gigahertz was made available for unlicensed. But I've seen calls from public safety saying, we need our radios updated so we don't have interference from low power Wi-Fi. But what's your sense on the motivation of the aviation industry?
There's been a lot of speculation. I've heard the speculation that, for example, as you pointed out, that some might want the federal government or the wireless companies to compensate them to upgrade these outdated altimeters. The irony of that is, number one, there's no engineering basis for that. But number two, even if there were, if they'd come to us in 2018 and 2019 and said, look, we've got this concern, we're not going to object to the auction, but we'd like some sort of compensation to help us upgrade to make sure that our radios don't essentially bleed over into the C-band inadvertently, we would have been open to that conversation, but they never did. And so that's sort of strange a year after the auction to be coming and saying, pony up, essentially, if indeed that's what they're saying. But more generally speaking, I think that's just not the way that we can do spectrum policy in the United States. And the 6 gigahertz band is another great example of it. I mean, I think consumers have only started to see the benefits of Wi-Fi 6E, and I'm really proud of that decision we made over the objections of several different industries, because at the end of the day, people who are watching this over the live stream, millions of consumers around the world rely on Wi-Fi, and if we hadn't made that entire band possible, we wouldn't have created a sandbox for all of these great Wi-Fi entrepreneurs to take advantage of those 160 or even 320 megahertz wide channels, deliver gigabit Wi-Fi to consumers. It's going to be transformative, and I think we've only scratched the surface of it. But it required, not to toot our own horn, but it required a little bit of courage at the FCC to be able to pull that trigger over the opposition of these very powerful industries.
Well, you can toot your horn. I think it was a very good decision. And again, the U.S. was the first one out of the box on that in April 2020.
Yeah, but we're not the last, as you see. Other countries around the world are now following that decision. And so it's great to see. I hope we can get some more harmonization.
And it's exciting. And we're at the Pacific Telecom Council, and most of the countries that have done something on it, rim the Pacific. We've got folks in, well, of course, South Korea quickly followed your lead and at the full 1,200 megahertz. That was very exciting.
Fantastic.
But Japan, Malaysia, India
Yeah.
are looking at it, and Australia looking at, again, they might be looking at just the lower 500, but we welcome a full review of all of it. And again, in the Americas, right, of course, from Canada, US, down all along the Western Pacific rim of Latin America, they're making decisions. So it is very exciting, and we're making progress. It is being reviewed at the World Radio Conference, which is coming up in 2023, but where Huawei perhaps was the successful proponent of looking at the upper band for IMT, but
Right.
Hopefully the market for Wi-Fi 6E devices will be taking off, and there'll be enough out there to convince folks that's perhaps a better way to go. But in your investment role now, are you seeing devices coming onto the market? Is there interest at Searchlight in some of the developments in Wi-Fi 6?
We do have an interest in it. Some of the IoT type applications that are out there, we haven't invested yet, but we certainly have tried to cast a wide net. But to me, at least, I think, I recently had lunch with Bill Kennard, a friend of mine and President Clinton's second FCC chair just last week. And one of the things I was mentioning to him is that we look at Wi-Fi, the way we think about Wi-Fi today would have been inconceivable, back in '99 when he freed up the 2.4 gigahertz band. I'm convinced that in 10, 15, 20 years from now, we'll look at Wi-Fi in the 6 gigahertz band the same way, because we've never had such a wide test bed for innovation. And so I'm pretty convinced that all these great entrepreneurs and innovators we have out there will start creating these great businesses and devices, and hopefully companies like mine can start investing in them. And that's a good thing for those companies, for consumers, and ultimately for the country.
Yeah, I think you're right. The FCC, even, yes, before your time, had a good track record of making the spectrum available, and then the silicon development kind of catches up over time.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So what are some of the more interesting investments you're looking at, or some of your other activities, in the 5G or other tech spaces?
Yes, and some of the things we are investing in other than digital infrastructure, we're looking at not necessarily 5G as such or even Wi-Fi as such, but some of the companies or technologies that surround it. So for example, open radio access networks, some of the semiconductors, there are some great companies out there creating programmable chips that can leverage both Wi-Fi and 5G spectrum at the same time to help support the creation of very smart managed Wi-Fi wireless networks. And just different companies like that in the space. So we're not sort of adjacent to telecom, but we're also looking at a number of fintech companies. Shift4, if any of those of you have you paid with at a point of sale, you might have seen Shift4's devices. That was our first investment. They went public a couple of years ago, and we're looking at more fintech investments as well. One of the things I'd like to learn about, we're not investing in it yet, but some of the blockchain-based technologies that might have relevance to telecom, and some great companies out there that are essentially looking to crowdsource spectrums that you can then document it on a distributed ledger and then maybe create a wireless network that way. And so just incredible how things have changed from just a couple of years ago, where these technologies seemed kind of pie in the sky. And now they're kind of pie on the ground, I guess you might say. So.
No pun intended with your name, right?
Exactly.
Now, you are having fun in the private sector, but of course spend a lot of time in government.
Yeah.
What do you think government, in particular in law enforcement, surveillance, how are they going to react to blockchain?
It's a good question. I've been watching keenly to see how people talk about blockchain, or in particular some of the like Bitcoin, stablecoin, all this other thing. And it's really interesting because here, as in spectrum, as in many other different areas, it's incredible the extent to which Washington has been governed by the precautionary principle, by which I mean that many people in Washington seem to think that it's better to essentially preemptively ban or heavily regulate something, even though a concrete harm hasn't materialized, as opposed to letting an emergent technology develop and then regulating more post hoc on the basis of antitrust law, consumer protection law, et cetera. And again, I'm no expert in blockchain by any means, but when you see some of the people who are more advocates of what you might call Web3 or some of the other crypto-based technologies, you're arguing with those who take more of the precautionary approach. There's just sort of not a meeting of the minds here. And I think, not so much about blockchain, but on something I do know something about spectrum, I think the danger is that the precautionary principle, while it may sound good in theory, over time may lead investors and innovators and others outside of the United States because they want to find a home where they're welcome, where they can do their work. And I would hate to see the United States become a country that's known more for being risk averse and where it's hard to do business and innovate, as opposed to one where anybody's welcome, where we actually draw people in. And not to say that that's where we're going to end up on blockchain, but I fear that some of the things I hear from politicians in Washington aren't really encouraging.
Right. Well, right. Are you seeing investment in other countries in blockchain or Searchlight Capital? Are you tracking some of that?
I mean, we're definitely tracking it. We haven't done any investing yet, and I personally have not poured all of my life savings into any of these things. Although I do have a Coinbase account, which is kind of fun to monitor.
That's impressive.
No, it's great. It's I really like that kind of company because what it's done is it's sort of democratized access to cryptocurrencies in a way that I don't think. I mean, how would you go about it otherwise? And so it's great to have an American-based company. It's very forward-thinking and transparent with consumers, and it's enabled me at least to get a foothold in a very small foothold, but a foothold nonetheless into some of these currencies. So that's the kind of thing we want to encourage for the exchanges, for the companies themselves to set up shop and innovate in the United States.
Right. No, that's very wise. So in addition to being a partner at Searchlight Capital, I hear you're serving on some boards. You want to tell us about any of your sideline activities?
Oh, sure. Well, I can't announce it quite yet, but working with a number of companies, and hopefully that'll be announced in the next several months, a couple of months, and it's just great. And one of the things I love is being on the outside. You get a little bit of this at the FCC, but more so on the outside, my current role, really getting to understand a business. What makes the business tick? What is the technology about? What's the quality of the management team? What's their capital structure? How are they poised for success? Who are the competitors? What are some of the regulatory constraints? And it's interesting when you view all of that from a private perspective, you really get a sense of how idiosyncratic a lot of these companies are, even in the same technological space. And so one thing that I've enjoyed with some of the companies that you're referring to is they've really done a good job in terms of resolving the technical merits of whatever the mousetrap is that they're building. They've got incredibly strong, talented management teams. And I think they're poised for success in a way that could be extremely disruptive in a good way for the benefit of consumers. And so as those announcements are made, you'll be the first to know, and those who follow me on Twitter, of course. I'm really excited about what those companies are going to be able to do. So here, too, it's just another way of hopefully trying to advance the ball for American innovation and you do well for consumers at the same time.
Well, in our closing 3 minutes we have here, of course, you were known for focus as the FCC chair of trying to close the digital divide, a lot of that through deregulation, as well as getting spectrum on the market. Of course, had a good focus on national security and a number of other things. Licensed a few submarine cables while you were there, started a processing round on non-geosynchronous satellites.
You're on a roll.
This
is great. I love this.
I'm a FCC regulatory attorney back in DC, so of course I followed what you were up to. But what are your thoughts on your tenure? How would you sum up your legacy?
I mean, it's always fraught with peril, especially since I'm less than a year out. But I think the things I'm proudest of are obviously our work helping to close the digital divide, our work on 5G, some of the work we did on consumer protection, things that probably haven't gotten nearly as much press as I think they deserve. Obviously, going after robocallers and things like that. But to me, the paradigmatic consumer protection issue for me was the creation of 988 as a 3-digit number for suicide prevention and mental health. That number will go live 6 months from now on July 16th of 2022. And so from that point forward, any American who's struggling can simply dial 988 on their phone and be connected to a trained counselor manned by the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And of all the decisions we've made, I mean, that one is just guaranteed, I know it in my bones, to save thousands of lives in the time to come. So I'm really proud of that. And the final thing is just making the agency more transparent. Now it's taken as a given, but when I started 4 years ago, as you remember, the first initiative I started in my second week was actually publishing what the FCC's proposals and orders would be at least 3 weeks in front of an FCC vote at our public meetings. And at the time, I was told by lawyers, you shouldn't do it. I was told by politicians, this is going to be dangerous. It didn't make any sense to me, but now anyone, anywhere in the world can read what the FCC is going to do before it happens. And I think that's something that makes me really proud as well. And so it was kind of nice, I will say. I was back in my hometown a couple of months ago. I grew up in a small town in rural Kansas. And I met with my 8th grade teacher, and who's still teaching at Meadowview Elementary School. And she asked me, what are some of the things you're proudest of? And I told her, as I looked around the classroom of 8th graders, very much like me, sitting in those same chairs in 1985, 86, to be able to know that these kids are going to have the opportunity that anybody in a big city, anywhere in the world is going to have, that really makes me feel good, because I think that's the promise of digital technology, is that it levels the playing field, that no longer is there going to be a situation where talent will miss out because there's not opportunity. That, to me, is the promise of the digital world, and to be able to do a little bit during my time at the FCC to help achieve that result, it makes me feel pretty good. And I'm glad she gave me a hug as a result of that answer. It's kind of nice.
You finally got that A+ you were looking for, right?
Yes, indeed.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Ajit for joining us today.
Thanks very much. Thanks, this is great.